Well, welcome. I know you don't necessarily want to be here per se on a weekend listening to a lecture, but this will get us caught up from that snow day last Monday. So, to begin, I want to really pick up where we left off before. Really the story in many ways of the Enlightenment in Spanish America and the different manners in which this plays out. And so by way of review, in the 20 minutes that we had in class on Friday, I spoke a bit about reforms. And in terms of Spanish America, the Bourbon reforms specifically are an example of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment being used, among other things, in this instance, really to reinforce the powers that be, that is to say, the power of the state. And so let's review real quick. I'll pull up a map here, and you can get a sense of where we were last time in terms of the reforms of the 18th century and the manner in which the Spanish crown is really clamping down over the course of the 18th century, trying to reimpose its authority upon Spanish America. And here we have Philip V. And again, Philip V comes to power in the early 18th century. He was the so-called heir, as it were, to Charles II, and following being named by Charles in his will upon Charles's death, following the War of the Spanish Succession more especially, he is confirmed as King of Spain in the early 18th century, and he'll go on to rule through the mid-18th century. He will be succeeded by his sons. The purpose, the significance of this, among other things, is what we talked about last time, the Bourbon reforms. His sons after him, will set about to really remake the Spanish Empire along French lines. And among other things, they're really trying to reimpose the powers of the state upon an America that had enjoyed a great deal of autonomy and independence over the course of the 17th century as the Spanish Empire had declined. Among other things, he will set about, and his heirs more especially, to remake the manner in which the political geography of Spanish America, of South America, looked like. And so last time in class I talked about the fact that Spanish America was ruled by viceroyalties, which were then divided up into audiencias, from there to provincial districts, and from there to municipalities and so forth. This is a map that shows you the audiencias in South America during the 16th and the 17th centuries. And so this is what things really look like, as it were, a single viceroyalty, a series of audiencias, you can see them here. This is what things really look like, as it were, prior to the Bourbons coming to power. Well, the Bourbons come to power, they set out to remake this map. Among other things, they'll create new viceroyalties in South America. They'll create new audiencias. In terms of the audiencias that you're looking at here, the audiencia of Caracas will thereafter be formed in the northern part of South America, of Cusco in this area here of South America in the late 18th century. Beyond that, of course, new viceroyalties are created as well. Traditionally, the Viceroyalty of Peru had included all of South America, dated to the middle of the 16th century. In terms of other viceroyalties that are created, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, based out of Bogota, is created in 1717. The Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, based out of Buenos Aires, is created in 1776. And again, the purpose of all of this is to reimpose the power of the state so that Spain can take advantage of its new world resources. What is the consequence of this? Well, among other things, local elites in some of these faraway places that had traditionally enjoyed autonomy become very angry, discouraged, among other things, have reasons to seek independence following the creation of new viceroyalties in Buenos Aires or in Bogota, because suddenly now they find themselves under the rule of the Spanish king in a manner where in the past they had enjoyed a great deal of autonomy and independence. Okay, well, this brings us to another point in all of this in terms of the Enlightenment, and that is the fact that across the Americas, new Enlightenment ideas are being used for other things as well. You've got a number of revolutions that are referred to at the end of class last time that occur really in the late 18th century across the Americas that speak to the manner in which new ideas are bringing change to the hemisphere. The examples that I gave specifically included the case of the United States and its independence in the late 18th century. This is a fairly kind of conservative movement compared to what you'll see in other places across the Atlantic, across Europe. In Latin America, the Caribbean, and Europe, you also have a series of uprisings that we've talked about in class that I highlighted last time. The French Revolution begins in 1789. The Haitian Revolution begins in 1791. In Brazil, we had two uprisings that I spoke about. The Inconfidencia Mineira, or the Minas Conspiracy, in the late 1780s. The Taylor's Revolt in 1798. And of course, there's the Great Rebellion in Peru that we've not talked about at length at all in class, but was essentially an indigenous uprising in the early 1780s. Breaks out ultimately into a race war, terrifies the elites in the New World in terms of Spanish America. What's the point of all of this? Well, the point is, in terms of revolution, in terms of change in Spanish America, because of your mixed racial slave societies, the legacies really of social revolutions in Europe, in the Americas, large indigenous populations in places like Peru and so forth, Creole elites. And here when I say Creole, and it's a term I'll put on the board here in just a moment, I'm referring to Spaniards who were born in the New World. But Creole elites in Spanish America are scared. And ultimately they're not willing to really embrace change, as it were, in many ways. Although many are frustrated because of things like the Bourbon reforms, they're interested in political independence and autonomy. They're not willing, as it were, to play with radical ideas if these ideas could ultimately have them lose their head. And so ultimately, change in Latin America, that is to say independence in Spanish America, is something that will have to come in many ways from without. And that's really what brings us then to the beginning of today's lecture, or rather the continuation of Friday's lecture where we left off. Now, if I'm going to give a lecture on video, I don't have a chalkboard here that I can use in order to, give you a sense of the terms really that we're talking about. And so in this respect, what I'm going to do is just really take a step back for a moment. I'm going to put the terms on the screen so that you can see them. You can pause your computer for a moment, write them down and whatnot. Additionally, I'll work it so that the terms themselves will pull up in the middle of the lecture as I give them over the course of the next 30 minutes or so. So here are the terms. And here you can see our list of terms for today's lecture. Among other things, I want to highlight the fact that some of these terms speak to things that you saw last time in class on Friday. Among other things, when we talked about how Spanish overseas government was organized, the viceroyalty is referred to here, an audiencia is referred to here, and of course also the term Creole that I just referred to in the lecture that you haven't seen spelled before is right here as well. As we move along in the lecture, these will pop up. I'm going to pause for a minute. You can pause just so you can write them down as well if you'd like. Okay, well, let's begin. Really, the beginning of our story again takes us back to the story of a variety of different people that we've talked about before, including Napoleon Bonaparte. And so, first off, in terms of all of this, 1807, same point in time that Napoleon is invading Portugal, essentially, he has designs on other places as well. In 1807, Napoleon of France is at war, really, with England. He's trying to close down European ports to English trade and so forth. This has an effect as well, not only on the Portuguese that we've already talked about, but upon the Spanish as well. And so let me introduce you to the Spanish royal house at this point in time, and a variety of other characters, as it were, that are part of this as well, and more specifically one other character. So I'm going to cut to some pictures so that you can see who these people are that we're talking about. I can give you some brief background in terms of who they are as well. Okay, this on our left is the King of Spain at this point in time. His name was Charles IV. In terms of background, Charles was born in 1748. He'll eventually die in 1819. He was the second son of his father, Charles III. Very large man. He's said to have had, among other things, limited mental capacities. In fact, his elder brother had been passed over the throne because of mental retardation. Well, Charles comes to power in 1788. He is the king at this point in time in the early 19th century, where all of these events will take place that we'll talk about. Over the course of his reign, he's really dominated by two people. The first is his wife. And here you can see her on the right. Her name is Maria Luisa of Parma, Maria Louisa was born in 1751. She'll eventually die in 1819. The other person who dominates Charles IV is his chief minister, and this is the chief minister here. His name was Manuel de Godoy. Manuel de Godoy was born in 1767. He will live to 1851. And again, he was the chief minister of Charles IV. He essentially is running everything in the king's name. In terms of running everything, it should be noted, among other things, that Godoy was Maria Louisa's lover. At least two of the royal children are said to look more like Godoy than Charles. And this perhaps brings us to the other factor in all of this, the children, or rather one of the children. Here you see him here. This is Ferdinand, the heir to Charles IV. He'll eventually be known as Ferdinand VII, and he also plays a prominent role in all of this as well. So this gives you a sense of our cast of characters. All right. Well, we've set up our cast of characters. Let's move on in terms of what happens with this cast of characters. To begin, Manuel Godoy, 1807, decides to negotiate a treaty with Napoleon. Among other things, he pledges Spain's support, its allegiance to France, in return for Godoy, who again is negotiating the secret treaty, being made king of the southern half of Portugal. Among other things, this is a way to get himself out of Spain. Well, why would he want to leave Spain? A variety of factors. As I noted before, he was having an affair with the king's wife. And yet the king knew all about this, it said, and he'd done nothing to stop it. But perhaps this plays a part in this. Beyond this, more specifically, Godoy was extremely unpopular across Spain at this point in time. Really, every segment of Spain's population, the masses, the aristocracy, nobody likes him at all, except, of course, the king and more especially the queen. Beyond this, he was particularly detested by Ferdinand, the king's son and heir, the future Ferdinand VII, the heir to the Spanish throne, who incidentally was very, very popular among the Spanish people at this point in time. Well, Godoy has negotiated this treaty with the French that Spain will maintain their loyalty to France and to Napoleon at this point in time. Everything thereafter changes, however, in March of 1808, when Napoleon goes back on his promise to make Godoy a king of Spain. Instead, he sends a French army into Spain to take over and to more especially target the royal family. Meanwhile, the army's marching in, as it were, across the peninsula. There's a riot near the royal palace against the crown, more especially against Godoy, who was imprisoned. The people are essentially rising up with their frustration. Charles, the king, will subsequently abdicate in favor of his son Ferdinand VII in order to placate the people, placate those who captured Godoy and who are really threatening his life. He abdicates the Spanish throne to his son. And again, this is Ferdinand VII. Well, this is the point where Napoleon's army arrives onto the scene. In terms of this, the army will free Godoy, and it will trick the royal family, including both Charles and Ferdinand, to come to France for a conference. Well, once they're in France, they're completely in the control of Napoleon. And thereafter you see a series of additional abdications, as it were, taking place under duress, of course. Charles will first be forced to abdicate his right to the throne, this time not to his son Ferdinand, with whom it said he almost comes to blows. They're so mad at each other at this point in time. But rather, Charles abdicates to Napoleon. In turn, Ferdinand, who's angry at Napoleon, refuses to, abdicate his right to the throne. He gives it back, as it were, to his father. You'll recall, in Spain, right before all of this had occurred, he'd been made king. His father had abdicated the throne, as it were. Well, this point, all of the necessary legal niceties, as it were, are out of the way. Napoleon is the one, of course, who's really in control, and he's tried to make it legal, as it were, as well. He names his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, to become the new king of Spain. Well, meanwhile, let's leave France behind. Let's go back to Spain. What's going on in Spain? Well, in Spain, the Spanish people are incensed at the French. They rise up in rebellion in the streets of Madrid in early May, starting on May 2nd, 1808. The rebels conduct a guerrilla-style insurgency campaign, and it's actually from this very time that we get the term guerrilla insurgency, as it were. Across Spain and in the New World, you've got then crisis. Who do you look for to be your king? Who do you look to rule? And in response to this, you'll find the creation of various committees, or in Spanish, juntas, that will be established to rule in the name of the old monarchy. The main junta will be established in Seville in the south. Later on, as Napoleon's forces begin to take over additional parts of Spain, pushing towards the south, this council, as it were, is eventually forced to flee in 1810 to Cadiz, which is on, essentially, as it were, on the ocean. They're being pushed further and further south. There, it will be reconstituted. It will take on the name of the Regency Council. It is the main council in Spain, the main junta, that's ruling in the name of the old monarchy, as it were. Ruling, of course, very, very nominally. They've been pushed to the very, very south of Spain. They're essentially being pushed to the ocean, and Napoleon, as it were, and his army is controlling the mass of the peninsula. Well, that's what's going on in Europe. What's going on in the Americas? Well, meanwhile, in the Americas, Creole elites, and again, Creole simply refers to Spaniards who are born in the New World, as it were, natives of the New World, rather than being born in the Old World. In Spain, these individuals born in the Old World are referred to as peninsulares. But Creoles, Creole elites in the New World are suddenly able to enjoy much greater autonomy than previously during the 18th century following the Bourbon reforms, when the crown again in the 18th century was set to reimpose its authority upon the New World. So these elites, because of this crisis in Europe, suddenly have a great deal more freedom, autonomy, and so forth. The general question that they face, though, is who do you follow at this point in time? Who is your rightful king? Is it Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, who claims to legally be the king of Spain? Is it your local viceroy, be it in Buenos Aires, or in Lima, Peru, or in Mexico, and so forth? Is it the Regency Council that's based out of Cadiz that's ruling in the name of the king? Or do you follow one of your own local provisional juntas that are established in the Americas to rule in the king's name? Well, the answer to this question would generally vary over the length and the breadth, really, of Spanish America. Generally speaking, there was some attempt by Creole elites to work together with the Regency Council in Cadiz, which had all sorts of liberal ideas in its day in terms of forming, for example, more of a constitutional monarchy and so forth. However, the Regency Council in Cadiz, in terms of its liberal ideas, really envisages an imperial relationship with Spanish America. Additionally, there's a real fear in Spanish America that all of Spain is going to quickly fall to Napoleon. It didn't seem to make a lot of sense to align themselves with Cadiz if Cadiz was going to fall shortly to the French. Well, thereafter, in the midst of this crisis, these crises really, various groups of Creole elites in the Americas will begin to take up arms to fight for independence. And this was particularly true after 1810. So, the long and the short of it, in terms of all of this, I've given you the long version, let me give you the short version. The big picture summary: Napoleon will capture the Spanish King Charles IV, invade Spain, place his own brother on the Spanish throne in 1808. This creates a crisis of legitimacy not only in Spain, but across the Spanish world, including the Americas. Creoles and peninsulares abroad are left with the question, who should they look to for legitimate government? Juntas, or committees, will be established all over the place to rule in the name of the king, or also in the name of the king's son, who again was very popular, the future Ferdinand VII. And in the midst of this crisis, revolutionaries will begin to conspire as well. Generally, then, all revolutions in Spanish America will be led by Creole elites who see the Peninsula Wars in Europe as a chance really to gain political freedom, to maintain, as it were, their place in a political system where suddenly they're the ones who are calling the shots in the New World. So, the long and short, as it were, crisis of legitimacy is what really leads, as it were, to the coming of independence in Spanish America. Now, if this were live, this would be the point where I would normally pause for questions. Instead, what I want to do is just show you a few pictures that speak really to some of the characters in terms of independence coming to Spanish America. Well, in terms of the cast of characters that I've mentioned, I just want to reiterate again that really this all begins, as it were, with Napoleon. You can see Napoleon here. He's born in 1769. He'll eventually die in 1821. In terms of Napoleon, he actually serves as a ruler of France as the first consul between 1799 and 1804. This is essentially as the first consul of a republic, the French Republic. 1804, he has different ideas. He has himself proclaimed emperor. And he will rule as emperor of France then between 1804 and again until 1814. Briefly, he's restored to power as emperor between March and June of 1815, but for all intents and purposes, by this point in time, it's over. Well, you can see Napoleon here. Among other things, he's always depicted with his hand in his shirt. The question is, why? What is the significance of that? Over the years, different people have had all sorts of different ideas. I just want to share some with you ever so briefly. Some people say he had a stomach ulcer, that he was winding his watch, he had an itchy skin disease, that in his era it was impolite to put your hands in your pockets, that he had a deformed hand, that he kept a perfume sachet in his vest that he sniffed surreptitiously, and my favorite, that painters don't like to paint hands. Now, why does he have his hand there? This is just a classical pose. It has absolutely nothing to do with Napoleon, even if that's what we associate with him today. Well, in terms of our other characters, if you look here, this is a revolutionary in South America. His name was José de San Martín. He was born in 1778 in what is today eastern Argentina. His father was a professional soldier and government administrator during the late colonial period, and he would follow in his father's footsteps. When he's 6 years old, his family will take him to Spain, where he'll be educated. Eventually, he'll start a military career in Spain, and he'll actually fight in the Spanish army as an officer against Napoleon between 1808 and 1811. This being said, he did not like the absolute monarchical systems that existed in Europe at the time. In 1811, he resigned from the Spanish service. He'd travel from continental Europe to London, England, and then he would sail from there to Buenos Aires. Almost immediately, he joined the revolutionary regime as a general. Plays a prominent role in bringing independence to what is today Argentina, the southern cone, really. Another character in all of this is Simón Bolivar. Simón Bolivar came from a very wealthy background. He was born in July of 1783 in Caracas, Venezuela. He lost both of his parents when he was very, very young. His father died when he was 2 years old. His mother died when he was 9. He inherited thereafter a fortune, was left to the care of his uncle, would receive an excellent education. He'd become familiar in terms of this education with the works of the Enlightenment. He'd read about classical Greece and Rome and so forth. At the age of 15, his uncle would send him to Spain to continue his education. He'll leave then in 1799 for Spain. On the way, he'll stop in Mexico City. He's a young man. All sorts of ideas. He said that he met with the viceroy in New Spain at this point in time. Terrified the viceroy because of his radical ideas about Spanish-American independence. Well, in Spain, he'll meet his wife, he'll marry, and then he'll return to Venezuela. She gets yellow fever, however, and dies thereafter. He's overcome with grief. He promises himself he will never marry again. and he actually kept this vow. He never remarried. Well, he'll eventually return after his wife's death to Europe. He'll tour around, he'll travel. This, of course, is the point in time when Napoleon is on the rise in France. He does not like Napoleon at all. He feels that Napoleon, having himself declared emperor, had betrayed his republican ideals. He'll travel through Europe and on and on. It's eventually said that while he's in Italy on a trip atop a mountain near Rome, that he takes the vow, as it were, that he would never rest until South America was free from Spanish rule. 1807, he'll return to Venezuela after a brief trip to the United States. He'll spend his really the entire rest of his life fighting for independence in Spanish America. So these are some of the characters that are essentially trying to take advantage, as it were, of the crisis that's going on in Europe during the early 19th century, when Napoleon is set on domination, really, of continental Europe and, of course, in Napoleon's eyes, even beyond. Something I want to point out, if you look at these two images, really what we started out with and so forth, here you can see Simón Bolivar. He's doing a Napoleon. And here, San Martin, again the same thing. And of course, where we started out with Napoleon like this. Again, this is simply a classical pose. All right, well, that gives you a sense of kind of what's going on, as it were, in terms of some individuals that are plotting, as it were, the coming of independence. I want to give you a particular case study of how independence comes to a particular part of Spanish America. And that's specifically what we today refer to as the Southern Cone, the southern part of South America. In terms of this, it's helpful perhaps to review very quickly, and I'll show you a map in just a moment. But Buenos Aires, as we talked about before, had been raised to the seat of a viceroyalty really only a generation before, in 1776. And you can see that on the map that I showed you earlier. And again, here you can see the new viceroyalties that were created as part of the Bourbon reforms in the 18th century, including New Granada here, but more especially for our purposes right now, the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata in 1776, Buenos Aires. Well, returning again, prior to this point in time, prior to Buenos Aires being a viceroyalty, the city had largely been important on account of the smuggling opportunities that it had provided. Spaniards and Creole elites and so forth smuggling, among other things, silver from Peru, from what is today Bolivia, smuggling it out of the Spanish world through Buenos Aires. Consequently, royal authority was not as firmly established in the region as in other places. Again, Buenos Aires had only been risen, as it were, to a viceroyalty a generation before. Well, how does this then all play out in the midst of this crisis? In late May of 1810, a junta will be established in Buenos Aires, proclaiming direct loyalty to Ferdinand VII and seizing power in Buenos Aires from the local viceroy. Everything this junta is doing initially, it is doing in the name of the king, as it were, in the name of the king's son, more specifically, Ferdinand VII, but it's not a conservative movement at all. It was actually a very, very radical movement. Once they seize power, they open up the ports of Buenos Aires to trade with all nations. Also, the junta will proclaim the equality of all citizens at this point in time as well, although in practice you'll see that they will be very careful to exclude really non-white sectors of the population from government. It is elites that are doing all of this. More generally, this junta was attempting to maintain the interests of elites that are specifically in Buenos Aires. These elites are referred to as the porteños, and here you can see the term. Well, from there, the junta will attempt to export its revolution, as it were. Initially, fighting will go on between Buenos Aires and more conservative elements of the cities in the interior. This will eventually be put down. In 1813, a national assembly will be called in the name of the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. Though they hadn't actually proclaimed independence yet, as it were, it's very clear that it's only a matter of time. They've already given themselves a name. Again, the the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata, and they're having their own national assembly in 1813. Well, what did these so-called United Provinces include? Basically, the boundaries of the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, that is to say, modern-day Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, portions of modern-day Chile. Essentially, they're taking the viceroyalty that had been created in 1776, and they're using it as the boundaries, as it were, for their new nation. However, the Creole elites in Buenos Aires have a problem, and that is the fact that not everyone wants to be a part of their new union, as it were, their new united provinces. Not all of these places want to participate in their revolution, nor really to be part of a union that had really been forced upon them a generation before as part of the Bourbon reforms of the late 18th century, when the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata had been created in 1776. Again, prior to this point in time, many of these areas, they're far away from Lima, Peru, the old Viceroyalty. Many of these areas had enjoyed a great deal of autonomy and independence. And so, what is the consequence of all of this? What is the point of all of this? Is that the coming of independence to the southern cone of Spanish America, to the southern part of South America, isn't a story at all about union. Rather, it's a story of fragmentation, of disunion, the fracturing of Spanish America along old political and cultural fissures that went back really decades, in some cases centuries. Again, the important point, in terms of independence, the region's old colonial past was extremely, extremely important. And in terms of this, you can literally see it on the modern day map. Let's go to the map, and I'm going to take you not only through a modern day map, but put it up with the maps of the day and earlier periods to give you really a sense of how all of this fragmentation occurs along these old political and cultural fissures. All right. As our first example, let's take the case of modern-day Bolivia. So if we look at our map here, you can see Bolivia here in the central part of South America here. In terms of Bolivia, it is a good example of the old fissures in Spanish America's colonial geography. Traditionally, going back in time, Bolivia had been the Audiencia of Charcas. And here you can see it. Again, this dates really to the 16th, the 17th century. It was one of these administrative units underneath the Viceroyalty of Peru. Traditionally, again, the Audiencia of Charcas. Its silver-producing economy was traditionally oriented towards Lima, towards the old Viceroyalty of Peru. Well, along come the Bourbon reforms. 1776, you have the creation of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, based out of Buenos Aires. Its borders include the old Audiencia of Charcas. Well, between 1812 and 1815, then, the Porteños in Buenos Aires attempt to take Upper Peru, to essentially force their new union, their new republic, as it were, upon this old Audiencia that had traditionally enjoyed a great deal of autonomy prior to 1776, and that had traditionally been associated with Peru rather than with Buenos Aires. Well, again, between 1812 and 1815, Porteños from Buenos Aires will attempt to take Upper Peru on 3 different occasions. In each instance, they are ultimately defeated by loyalists from Peru. Buenos Aires will eventually abandon what will become Bolivia in 1815. And again, if we go back here, you can see the old Audiencia of Charcas essentially becomes the country Bolivia. Another example, let's go to the case of Paraguay. You can see Paraguay here on our map. Paraguay had traditionally not been its own Audiencia, but rather a poor backwater Spanish province. And again, the provinces were what fell underneath the Audiencias, as I showed you in class on Friday. Well, the Porteños from Buenos Aires down here will try to take this old part, this old province. They'll try to take it in 1811, but they'll be beaten back by loyalist militias. Thereafter, a local junta will be set up in Asunción, which will eventually give way to the rule of a local caudillo, or strongman. We'll talk about caudillos and caudillismo in class after spring break. Again, what is the point here? We're fracturing. Spanish America is fracturing on old lines, as it were, that had predated the Bourbon reforms, that had predated the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, created in 1776. A final example. Going back here to our map, let's take the case of what is today Uruguay. You can see Uruguay here on our map. Traditionally, this area had been a contested region between the Spanish and the Portuguese. In fact, during the same point in time when all of these events are going on in the Spanish world, in Brazil, Carlota Joaquina, and again you'll recall the royal family had fled to Brazil in 1807. Carlota Joaquina was the Spanish princess who was married to João VI. Carlota Joaquina of Brazil would attempt really to establish her own fiefdom in this part of South America here. You'll have a small war break out between the Spanish and the Portuguese, really at this point in time, between liberals also and conservatives, Spanish liberals and conservatives here. Eventually the British will step in. They'll establish the buffer state of Uruguay. And here you can see, Uruguay as it is on our map. Well, again, why is all of this important? It speaks again to the fact that the modern map, modern political geography, really has its roots in this colonial period, as everything really is falling apart, falling back, as it were, fracturing along old political, along old cultural fissures that had, long predated the Bourbon reforms that we talked about in class on Friday. All right. Well, that gives you a sense, as it were, of the disunion that you have with the coming of independence in the southern cone of Spanish America. Independence happens in different places, in different ways, but generally speaking, this is the sort of thing that you'll have. You'll end up with, dozens, as it were, of modern Spanish-speaking countries in the Americas, rather than a single united Spanish America that's independent. Well, let's return very, very quickly to Europe to bring all of this, as it were, to an end. By 1814, by 1815, Napoleon is on the run. He's eventually defeated definitively in 1815, but prior to this, he and his army really have been driven out of Spain. In 1814, then, Ferdinand VII, Charles IV's son, returns to power. And he's left with the question of what in the world he is to do with a Spanish America now that's fragmented, that has various places that have declared independence, that's in a state, as it were, of disarray. What is he going to do? Well, first off, of course, he's got to consolidate his hold on power in Europe, and this is no small feat. Eventually, he'll turn his gaze to the Americas. More specifically, January 1st, 1820, 6 years after he has come to power, he has amassed 14,000 men. They're assembled at Cadiz, at the port in southern Spain. Their purpose will be to sail across the ocean to retake the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. What happens at this point will have a profound effect on everything, as it were, that comes afterwards. What happens? The soldiers, the 14,000 men that have been assembled, they mutiny. Among other things, they had had a lack of pay. The Crown had said it was going to reduce the size of the armed forces at this point in time. These men, these soldiers who had been sent to retake, Rio de la Plata, are angry. And in 1820, January 1st, 1820, they mutiny. Had they gone to South America, had they crossed the ocean, independence in the southern cone might very well have been prevented. But they never make the trip. By the 1820s, then, it is apparent that independence will come not only to the southern cone, but really to the rest of Spanish America. Instead of a unified independence, however, you get a disintegration, really, a return to the political landscape before the Bourbon reforms. Well, I'm going to show you a series of pictures that speak to some of this. We're going to come back in just a moment to some final thoughts that will really lead us in, as it were, to our lecture on Monday. All right. Well, to begin our cast of characters again, here we have Charles IV of Spain. I spoke about him earlier. Maria Luisa of Parma, his wife. Quite the lovely couple. And just in terms of some other additional information, in terms of his mental capacities, again, Charles IV was said to be very, very sluggish. His older brother had been passed over the throne for the throne because of mental retardation. He, after he became king, devoted really his entire life really to hunting. The affairs of state were really left to his wife. And again, here you can see his wife, Maria Louisa of Parma, who was involved in all sorts of court intrigues over the course of her time in power, her husband's time in power, even before this, really. Her lover and the king's chief minister was Manuel de Godoy. You can see Godoy here. Godoy, as I indicated, is the lover of Maria Louisa. Additionally, he has other mistresses as well. Eventually, of course, they're all captured by Napoleon. The king will take a pension, and the three of them will live together then until both the king and the queen die. Here you can see Manuel Godoy, quite the character. And in all of this, of course, as well, we've got Ferdinand VII. Again, he's born in 1784. He'll die in 1833. He did not like Godoy at all, and he will eventually become the king after Napoleon is defeated. You gotta love his breeches. All right, moving on. We have here an image that shows the surrender of Madrid in 1808 as Napoleon's troops enter into the Spanish capital. This is during the Peninsular War. Another image here is a painting, a very famous painting by Francisco de Goya. The painting itself dates to 1814, but it shows a scene from May 3rd, 1808, as French troops are executing Spaniards who have risen up against the French army and have started an insurgent guerrilla war against French forces. So famous painting here, you can see the troops, the French troops here, and the Spaniards, the people in the streets rising up in frustration against Napoleon's troops. The image here looks relatively small. The reality is that this is a huge portrait, a huge painting, I should say, that's on display at the Museo del Prado in Madrid. It is in reality about 3.5 meters by 2.5 meters in size. So again, the Spanish rising up against their oppressors. Well, of course, eventually Napoleon will be defeated. This is a famous painting that shows the Battle of Waterloo, when once and for all Napoleon is defeated in 1815. And here we have our cast of characters again that I showed earlier. Here you've got Napoleon, José de San Martin, Simón Bolivar, among other revolutionaries in South America. A character that I didn't mention, but is important in terms of Mexico, is Miguel Hidalgo. Miguel Hidalgo is born in 1753. He will die in 1811 in the midst of fighting over Mexican independence. You can see he's a priest, among other things. The background here, we can see an image of the Virgin Mary and so forth. The coming of independence to Mexico is in many ways exceptional when compared to other parts of Spanish America. It does begin as a kind of uprising from underneath, as the poor are rising up in frustration and whatnot to this world that they live in. Eventually it'll be co-opted by elites and will take a very typical course, but it is an example of a bottom-up uprising in terms of independence in Spanish America, rather than the case of the Southern Cone, which I shared with you previously. Well, just a couple of final images that speak to, again, the role of the old colonial period in all of this. This is an image done, a painting, in Peru in the 1770s, and it's called America Nursing Spanish Noble Boys. Well, what does it show? I want you to look closely at this image. Among other things, it speaks to the manner in which Creole elites in Spanish America will look, as it were, to native, indigenous heritage of the New World as they attempt really to establish differences between Spanish America and continental Europe, between Spain and the Americas, its colonies. If you look here, you can see Mother America sitting, as it were, upon her throne in the middle of a park. Again, this is an image that's done in Peru in the 1770s. As I told you, the title is America, Nursing Spanish Noble Boys. And if you look here, you can see she's literally nursing very light-skinned little boys here. They're Spanish noblemen. Meanwhile, her own children, the children of America, and you can see the indigenous children here, are lying upon the ground, crying for their mother's milk, as it were. What do you see here? What is the purpose of this? Well, among other things, it expresses a popular Creole elite identity and a standard lament during the Bourbon reforms of the second half of the 18th century, invoking really their Americanness through a glorious Indian past and decrying the privileges of peninsular appointees at the expense of the sons of America. Essentially, Creole elites look to an indigenous past as they try to establish the intellectual foundations for their independence. Another image here speaks to this as well. It is, of course, a picture of the Mexican flag. And here you can see the Mexican flag. Here, what do you have in the middle? You have an eagle on a cactus with a snake in its mouth. This is an Aztec symbol. And again, it speaks to the manner in which Creole elites who have established now independent nations in the New World, such as Argentina eventually, or Paraguay, or in this case, Mexico, how they look to an indigenous past, an imaginary indigenous past, as they attempt to establish the foundations, as it were, for their new independent rule, for their break with Spain. Again, what is the point of all of this? The point is that the old colonial period is important in terms of understanding not only the modern political geography of Spanish America, but the intellectual foundations upon which these independent nations are founded in the 19th century. All right, well, returning again, as I said, by the 1820s, it's apparent that independence will come, not only to the Southern Cone, but also to all of Spanish America. Instead of a unified independence, however, you get disintegration, really, as I said, a return to the political landscape that existed before the reforms of the 18th century. The point in all of this is that the colonial past is important to understand, really, the modern map, the modern political geography of Spanish America. This being said, there is an exception in all of this, and that exception is in the Spanish Caribbean, which Spain will really hold on to for nearly another entire century. In the case of the Caribbean, Enlightenment ideas, reforms, are very much tempered, again, by the issue of slavery. Creole elites in places like Cuba, right next to Haiti, don't want to be victims of another Haitian revolution. And here in the Caribbean, then, you'll see the people maintain their loyalty to Spain on and on and on. Significantly, then, Spain's overseas empire will ultimately end really where it first began, in the Caribbean, as we'll talk about in class next time.